Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Wednesday night. Let's see, just about everybody has gotten in. I'm hoping you can hear me, and I'm hoping we'll share the screen in a minute, and then we'll be able to see the screen switch, which is always our goal, is to have the slides follow us along. So we do have a scheduling difficulty that I want to talk about. The good news is that we'll have a bonus class tomorrow night. The difficulty in scheduling I have is we're not going to be able to have classes next Tuesday or Wednesday. What I will do on both the classes for next Tuesday and Wednesday is I will I'll send you guys all some specific videos and some specific tests, which you can take the tests, and I will count the hours. The tests will all send me your grade when you're finished with the test. They email me your grade. And so after you take the test, whether you pass the test or not, I will get your grades, and I'll count that towards class hours. But there will be no class next Tuesday or Wednesday. I have a scheduling difficulty for both of those evenings, and my normal substitute teacher can't help us. So again, no class on Tuesday or Wednesday, but I will send you invitations for not a Zoom class, but for specific videos and for specific tests. And when you take the test will send me your grade and send you your grade, and I will count that towards your hours. And again, we will have a class tomorrow night, a bonus class that starts at 7 p.m. And that will make up some of our hours that we're potentially missing. If somebody has a problem and they cannot make the bonus class tomorrow night, that's not the end of the world. Again, we will send you out videos to watch and tests to take for next Tuesday and Wednesday. Now, I'm going to repeat all this again in a moment because we have a bunch of people who are just signing in now. Again, if I'm repeating myself, that's okay. And then I will repeat it another time before we end the night so everybody knows. So the news I have is I have a scheduling conflict for next Tuesday and Wednesday. So we are not going to have classes next Tuesday and Wednesday. We will have a bonus class tomorrow night. And on next Tuesday and Wednesday, I will send you videos to watch on YouTube, and I will send you class marker tests. Those class marker tests, after you take them, they will grade them, and they'll send an email to you for your grade, and they'll send an email to me with your grade, and I will count that time for your hours. But again, no class next Tuesday and Wednesday night. But there will be a bonus class tomorrow night, and next Tuesday and Wednesday, I will send you an email with special videos, recordings, and with special tests for you to take, and they will grade the tests and send me the result back. So sorry that we can't do any better next week, but again, my normal substitute is finishing her last radiation treatment and can't sub for me. So, she'll be ready to go after next week, but no good for next week. All right, so
Bruce, do you know what you're going to specifically on the bonus class tomorrow?
Math.
Fabulous.
Okay, is there anything else you might want? I'll be happy to do it, but math. Okay, so we'll stick with math. Math's important. So it's not as crucial as some of you guys think it is. You could get them all wrong, all the math questions wrong and still pass, but you really need to know the math so that nobody cheats you out of money or nobody cheats you out of commission. So again, we will do math tomorrow night on the bonus class. All right, so just about everybody signed in, and I know, I'm saying the same thing over and over again. I will talk about next week's classes again later on tonight, but there are no classes next week. You will get videos and you will get tests for next week. All right, so we're going to start on business opportunities, and it's really appropriate tonight that we start on business opportunities because I just got off the phone with my son. And my son is in the process. He has a business now. He has a restaurant in New Brunswick, Destination Dogs. And my son and his partners are getting ready to buy another restaurant in New Brunswick. And it's a restaurant, they're called Kelly's, I think it's called. It's over in the student section. I don't necessarily think it's a good idea, and I don't necessarily think it's priced correctly, but you get the chance to make your own decisions in life. So when you are selling a business, you will have to have a real estate license if a new lease is being negotiated, the building is included in the sale, and or there is an assignment of a lease. So in my son's case, on the new restaurant they're trying to buy, Murphy's in New Brunswick, forget whether it's Murphy's or Kelly's. I said Kelly's, but now I'm thinking it might be Murphy's. But anyway, it's in the 6th Ward in New Brunswick by the college. The building is included, and the price is going to be $1.1 million. And since the business is included, the person who is listing the property for sale must have a real estate license. And that person who is listing the property for sale is licensed with Davis Realty. So they do have a real estate license. If there was no real estate license, if you didn't want to have a real estate license required, there'd be no leases and there'd be no sale of the building. But a bar has a liquor license. So you could sell a liquor license as long as it didn't have a lease associated with it, or it didn't have a building associated with it. You could sell a liquor license without a real estate license and get paid a commission. And there are business brokers out there that just do exactly that. As a matter of fact, there are liquor licenses around that are what they call pocket licenses that aren't connected to any building. Once a liquor license is activated, it must be connected to a building. But there are pocket licenses out there that are not connected to any building. All right. The requirements from the Statute of Frauds and the Uniform Commercial Code say that they contract.
Sorry, Bruce, but the slides haven't changed.
All right. Always appreciate it when you guys tell me so we can correct it. Okay, so we should be on one that has all these bullet points now about the Statute of Frauds requirements. And the thank you. The requirements are the contract must be in writing for the sale of a business. Any representations or warranties must be included. I met with my accountant this afternoon about perhaps buying a real estate business that somebody else is running. And he was telling me that the representations are very, very dangerous in selling a real estate office, because that particular office that I'm looking to buy, they did so much business last year, but there is no representation or warranty that they're going to do that much business again next year. So again, it's buying a business like a real estate office is tricky. You also have to be aware of the transfer of a license, a franchise, or a distributorship. So with my son trying to buy this new bar, the liquor license, you have to make an application to the state, and the liquor license has to be transferred. If I was going to buy this other person's real estate office and they're a franchise, I would have to have permission from my franchise or Remax and their franchise or in order for the purchase to go ahead. And if I was buying maybe a auto parts store that had a distributorship connection, or I would have to make sure the distributorship followed the business. If you're going to buy an office or a business, for instance, the real estate office that I'm thinking of buying, I would want the current broker of that business to sign a covenant not to compete, because I wouldn't want him to sell me his business and then open up a new one and get everybody back to work for him again. Next thing is assignment of accounts receivable. So when you buy a business and you have money still hanging out there, let's say you have a real estate office and you have some commissions that are standing out there for maybe a commercial lease where you're only going to get paid half of the commission this year and half of it next year. Who gets that next year's commission? So an assignment of the accounts receivable. Also, certain businesses, if you're buying them, you have to make sure that the lease is going to allow, the landlord is going to allow the lease to be assigned. I had a client who had a eyeglass. He was an eye doctor, and he had an eye doctor office and an eyeglass store in Brooklyn. He had a wonderful, wonderful low lease on the building that he'd been in for a long time. But his lease specifically said that if the doctor tried to assign the lease to another party, that the rent would double. And so it made it really hard for the eye doctor to sell his business. So you've got to make sure that if there's an assignment of an existing lease or that the landlord is requesting a negotiation of a new lease, that that's covered in the agreement. And remember, anytime there's a lease involved, that definitely means you have to have a real estate license in order to get paid a commission for selling it. The next thing is the sale of the fixtures. So remember, fixtures are things that were once personal property and through method of attachment, adaptation, relationship of the parties, intent of the parties, or adaptation of the parties now became real property. But in businesses, you also have the additional consideration of, is something a trade fixture? So on the bar that my son's going to buy, the current person who is leasing the bar now and operating the bar, inside the bar, there's coolers and there's refrigerators. Are those trade fixtures, which means they're the personal property of the tenant that's in there now? Or are they going to be fixtures and stay with the building when my son buys it? The next thing is compliance with local zoning laws. And are you buying a business that complies with local zoning laws? And if there's a change of ownership, is the municipality going to allow you to continue that use? The next two things are important, and I'll tell you a story of how they came to hurt me one time. One is the Bulk Sales and Uniform Commercial Code, and one is the Bulk Transfer Act. So the Bulk Sales and Uniform Commercial Code say that if you're selling a business, the seller of the business must let the buyer know how much money the seller owes to people in relationship to the business. And in my specific case, I bought a pizzeria in Virginia Beach, near the beach in Virginia Beach. I got a very good price on it. And after I closed and I went to buy my high gluten flour, that's what you make pizza out of, and my mozzarella cheese and all my tomato paste, back in those days, this was before Restaurant Depot, and you bought all that stuff from Roma Food or Lisanti Food in Piscataway and in New York City. And when I went to buy my materials, those vendors refused to ship them to me because the previous owner still owed them money for when she owned the business. So the purpose of this Bulk Sales and Uniform Commercial Code, where the seller is required to let the buyer know to whom they owe money, is to keep that from happening. And in Virginia, they didn't have that rule. In New Jersey, they have that rule. The next rule is the Bulk Transfer Act. And that's a law that Governor Christie put into place. The Bulk Transfer Act requires the buyer to notify the state of New Jersey that a transfer of a business is imminent, is going to take place, and they must do it 10 days prior to closing. And the purpose of making that disclosure or making that request for that information is if you don't make that Bulk Transfer Act request and you close on the property, any sales taxes or other taxes like excise taxes on cigarettes or gasoline that the owner, the seller, didn't pay become the responsibility of the buyer. And my story on this is my son bought a restaurant down in Atlantic City. And when he bought the restaurant in Atlantic City, they didn't comply with this Bulk Transfer Act. And it turns out that the restaurant, just prior to my son buying it for like a month or so, you know, when you go to a restaurant, you have to pay sales tax. Well, they were collecting that sales tax from all their people who ate in the restaurant, but they were not forwarding that money to the state of New Jersey. So my son, in his stupidity, did not notify the state of New Jersey 10 days prior to closing that there was a closing. So when he closed, now he owed all that money in unpaid sales taxes to the state of New Jersey. That's the Bulk Transfer Act. And when you're selling real estate, when you guys get your licenses and you're selling certain kinds of property, you have to be aware of this. And some lawyers are very, very strict on this Bulk Transfer Act. For instance, if you're selling a two-family home, they actually make that notification to the state on a two-family home because the Bulk Transfer Act says if it is a business endeavor, and sometimes the attorneys think that the two-family home is a, quote, business endeavor. The next thing is financing. Very difficult to get financing on a business. and that's because 90% of all businesses fail within the first 5 years, or new businesses fail within the first 5 years. And the banks know that number. So the banks don't like to give financing on businesses. If you go to the SBA, the Small Business Administration, and again, I'm going to pick on my son again tonight. When they bought their first restaurant, their first bar, they're leasing the bar and they're leasing the liquor license, but they still had to buy the business, so to speak. When they went to buy the business, they didn't have enough money, so they had to get a loan. They got turned down, and you have to be turned down 3 times. When you're turned down 3 times for a loan, you can go to the Small Business Administration and you can apply for a loan from the Small Business Administration. Now, the Small Business Administration, when they give you a loan, they want to put a lien on real property. So when they were buying the bar, the business, of course, the people who owned the bar would not let them, who owned the real estate, would not let them put a lien on the property. So my son, on his personal residence, put the lien for the SBA loan on his personal residence. And in tonight's conversation, after him and his partners owning that restaurant bar for 10 years, I asked him, have you paid off the SBA loan yet? So that releases the lien on your principal residence. And he told me tonight that he's about 6 weeks away from having that happen. And I keep my fingers crossed because, I don't want to see him have a lien on his personal property for this loan that's for the business. Because if the business were to fail, then the SBA could foreclose on his house. The next thing is depreciation. So we talked in the chapter on taxes, how on real property, you depreciate 27.5 years on residential property and 39 years on non-residential property. That's depreciation for tax purposes on real property. We also have depreciation on things that are personal property. So for instance, if you buy a car, you might depreciate, and that's personal property, you might depreciate it over 7 years. So let's say you're buying a trucking company, and the trucking company has 10 tractor trailers that were $200,000 each. Well, if they're 7 years old, the transportation company that is selling it might have fully depreciated those tractor trailers. And each year, they would take 1/7 of the cost of those tractor trailers and use it as a depreciation allowance to offset income. And, that could be a lot of money that you're using to offset income. And once those vehicles are fully depreciated, then they no longer have the advantage of offsetting income. So if you're going to buy a business and it has a lot of personal property and or real property, you want to know exactly where it is in terms of the depreciation schedule. Again, the purpose of the bulk sales statute is to protect the purchaser from inheriting any tax debt from the seller or the seller's business assets. A bulk sale is the sale or transfer assignment of an individual's or company's business assets in whole or part outside the ordinary course of business. So again, you want to be aware of that bulk sale form that has to be filed with the state of New Jersey 10 days prior to closing. And here is a copy of the form. Fairly simple form, not a big deal, but it does give the state of New Jersey the ability to do some research and find out if the seller owes back taxes. And I'm not talking about income taxes. I'm talking about things like sales taxes and excise taxes, like the extra tax they charge on gasoline or the extra tax they charge on alcohol. Those are the taxes they want to make sure that you've paid, or cigarettes. Those are the extra taxes they want to make sure you've paid. Okay.
So Bruce, if you filed for that form, you wouldn't be responsible for if there were taxes if they didn't get back to you?
That's correct. That's correct. As long as you filed within 10 days before closing, at least 10 days before closing, then they can't hold you responsible for the unpaid taxes of the seller. So again, that's a very important thing that you want to make sure gets taken care of. And when does it not get taken care of? When does this bulk sales form not get filed? Well, it usually doesn't get filed when people do a deal without lawyers, because a lawyer would always know to file this. And, if you're a real estate agent and now you remember that I told you about this, if you're involved in the sale of a business, you might bring it up at some point and say to the lawyers, hey, did you guys file your bulk sales form? But most attorneys will have done that. But when it gets missed is when people aren't using attorneys, or they choose not to use an attorney. You don't have to use an attorney to sell a business. So sometimes, it gets missed. In the case of my son with buying his restaurant in Atlantic City, they missed it, and my son had to eat those back sales taxes. So when we look at a business, and today at my accountant's, we were discussing what this business, this other brokerage that I'm thinking of buying is worth. And, there's a big difference between what it's worth to me and what the seller thinks it's worth. But no matter what you buy and no matter what you sell in businesses, there is a formula. There's multiple formulas that come up with some kind of evaluation. But most of the formulas really relate to a multiple of the net, So for a real estate business, typically you would pay 1.9 the net. So if the net profits were $100,000, you'd pay $190,000 for it. Other businesses, like a car dealership, might be 4 times the net. So it just depends on what kind of business you have. And what determines the value of a business are things like the goodwill, Google reviews, goodwill. Also things like the net, how much you make at the end of the year. So in our multiple listing in Middlesex County, we have a number of businesses for sale. Actually, right now, this is an older list, but right now I have 3 laundromats for sale. And the laundromats are business only. There's no real estate for sale, only the businesses. And the leases, since there is a lease, because you have to renegotiate the lease of where those 3 laundromats are located, now that means it requires a real estate license to sell it. So the seller of the business asks us to list those 3 not laundromats. Laundromats are easy to sell. 3 dry cleaners. It's a gentleman who owns 3 dry cleaners, and he wants to sell his dry cleaners business. So what do we want to do? We want to make sure if we have a buyer, file the Bulk Sales Act. We want to negotiate the transfer of the leases. If a new buyer is going to buy it, we want to look at his documents to see how much he's paying in rent, how much he's paying in utilities. We want to see what his income is, and then we want to find out what his net is. And then dry cleaners sell for 3 times net. So dry cleaners sell for a higher multiple than real estate offices, but a lower multiple than car dealerships. On his dry cleaners, there is a difference between what he thinks they're worth and what I think they're worth. And the reason there's a difference is the gentleman who runs these 3 dry cleaners, his family operates all 3 of them. And they're forgetting the fact that the amount of money they make at the dry cleaners is really an expense. Because when you're looking at what a business is worth, you have to remember that if somebody is selling a business and you're trying to evaluate what it's worth, you have to pretend like you are not going to run the business. You're going to have to pretend like you're going to hire somebody to do every job. So on these dry cleaners, if he doesn't back out his salary, it looks like he has a high net. But if he were to sell them to just an investor, then he would have to pay somebody a salary to do his job, and then that would reduce the net. So the difference between what he thinks his value is and what I think his value is the amount that he pays himself that he is not counting. Therefore, it's giving him a much higher net because he's not counting what he makes. If somebody were to buy it, they're going to put a manager in there, and that's, of course, going to reduce the net. So those are the kind of things you have to talk about. Now, when I spoke to this particular owner of these dry cleaners, we talked about the fact that he might have to hold a mortgage. So when we go back to here about financing, when we talk about financing on a business, my advice to him is no lender is going to lend you the money, is going to lend a buyer the money to buy your dry cleaning business. You are probably going to have to find a cash buyer, or you're going to have to find somebody that you trust and hold a mortgage for them. Now, here's the problem. If you're selling that laundromat and you, the seller, are going to hold a mortgage for the buyer, what if the buyer screws up? And what if the buyer ends up ruining the business. When I teach these classes, sometimes it's just amazing how the universe sends me things to talk about. So I told you I was at my accountant's today talking about a other broker looking to sell his real estate offices. My accountant, who I liked a lot, had sold his accounting firm 6 years ago and retired. And the person who bought his accounting firm, of course, he couldn't get financing for it because an accounting firm is one of those type businesses that banks know, all the clients could leave tomorrow. There's nothing that makes the clients stay. So he had to hold a mortgage. And the gentleman to whom he sold his accounting firm reneged on the mortgage and violated a lot of his terms and conditions in his lease and his covenants. And the seller, who went to Florida and retired, had to unretire and come back up from Florida and come back to work in East Brunswick. So again, sometimes you're going to have to take financing. You're going to have to hold a mortgage to sell a business. And there is a risk that, first of all, the guy who bought it from you could ruin everything. And second, the guy who bought it from you might not be able to pay, and you're going to have to take the business back over again. So when you're working in businesses, you're quite often working in areas where it is seller financing. So here is another listing in the MLS for just a business opportunity, and there is no real estate involved. It's just the business. And again, this would be a business that you would have to file, of course, your Bulk Sales Act. And what's the business worth? Well, if you look inside, there's no business going on now. And so when you're selling a business that has no business, maybe it's closed or maybe it's been out of business for a year, then there's very little value in the business. So when people say I'm selling my luncheonette or I'm selling my pizzeria, but it's been closed for a year, but it has tremendous potential, what's the value? It's nothing. Tremendous potential does not give any value. All right, so on the test, the questions that are going to show up is the Bulk Transfer Act and the fact that you don't need a real estate license to sell a business if there's no real estate involved, or if there is no assignment of a lease involved. Then you can sell a real estate business. You can sell a business without a real estate license. I know a young lady who she goes around to all the dentists who are my age, and she offers to broker deals to sell their list of patients, but never their leases and never their buildings. And she does this all without a real estate license. All right, that brings us to environmental laws. And when you get your license, you're going to be concerned with many environmental things. You're going to, there's some of them are going to be headaches. Some of them are going to be things you have to be aware of. So again, New Jersey is a state. I told you the other night, we used to be called the Garden State because we had a lot of these small garden farms, but we also are known as a manufacturing state and an industrial state. Mack Trucks started out in New Jersey. Johnson & Johnson, their headquarters in New Jersey. Merck, their headquarters in New Jersey. Lots of companies, lots of industry, lots of offices. New Jersey was a welcome spot because of the availability of highly educated workers and the closeness to New York City and Philadelphia. If you cross the bridge from Trenton to Pennsylvania, on the bridge, they still have this sign up there. It says, "Trenton makes, the world takes." So we had a lot of manufacturing in New Jersey, and we had a lot of manufacturing before there were rules against pollution. So many of our industrial sites or industrial endeavors, or Mack Trucks, or Merck, or Rhodia Steel in New Brunswick, or Morrison Steel in New Brunswick, our a couple of the other chemical companies, Interstab Chemical, the Dutch chemical company that was on Jersey Avenue. They did business in New Jersey, they did manufacturing in New Jersey, and they dumped their byproducts into the groundwater. So we have got a lot of pollution in New Jersey, lots of areas of pollution. There's the rumor of the Toms River cancer cluster for certain pollution. there was a battery factory in Perth Amboy, and you know that the car battery factory, and you know that car batteries used to have lead in them. So there's a lot of lead pollution in Perth Amboy. And there's a whole area of Perth Amboy where there's a very high incidence of multiple sclerosis, which is one of the things that lead poisoning can cause. We also have a lot of areas in New Jersey that had septic systems instead of public sewers. And those septic systems sometimes were not correctly manufactured or installed or maintained. And so they leaked things into our groundwater into New Jersey. So because of that, we have a law that passed in New Jersey for housing called the Private Well Testing Act. And the Private Well Testing Act requires, if you are selling a house or renting a house that has a well for the water supply. So if you're going to supply the drinking water of the house with a well, then you have to comply with the Private Well Testing Act. And what we say is the potable water supply, that's your drinking water, your potable supply. If it's from a well, you have to comply with the Private Well Testing Act. And what the Private Well Testing Act requires is that you have a well test done to your well. So it's expensive. It's $700 now for a house. If you just have a well in your backyard for throwing pennies in and making wishes, that doesn't count. If you have a well in your backyard to take water out for watering the lawn, that doesn't count. But if you have a well for your potable water supply, you have to have it tested. And it runs around $700. It's expensive. A certified tester comes out from a company, takes a sample, sends it out for evaluation, provides the results to the state of New Jersey. While they are at the well, they geocode the well, so they get an exact location of the well. And then when they get the results of the pollution, they use those results to map where in New Jersey there's evidence of pollution. And sometimes they can find trends. And we can see some of the trends in this slide of different areas that have different forms of pollution. And sometimes they can backtrack where the pollution came from. Sometimes they can make some remediation of the pollution, or sometimes they can find the people who are responsible and charge them for the cleanup. So again, the Private Well Testing Act says that when you're selling a house that has a well for the potable water supply, you must do a well test. And the test is done by a state licensed agency and a state licensed vendor, and they provide the results to the state. The Private Well Testing Act does not require the seller to fix the well. It only requires them to test it and to provide the results to the buyer. And it also allows the buyer to cancel the contract if the results of the well test are bad and the seller does not want to do anything about it. So I live in Colts Neck and I have a well. I had a new well installed a couple of years ago. You know, it's expensive. It's $12,000 to have the new well installed. And I have a lot of arsenic and a lot of iron in the water here in Colts Neck. So we have a point of entry treatment system, and we test the water on both sides of the point of entry treatment system. And then you make your decision whether or not you're going to use it for drinking water. And in my case, my wife, who is environmentally sensitive, does not want to use our well water for drinking water or for cooking. So she has, bottled water that we use for all of that, but we still shower in our well water. And again, some days you can smell some of the arsenic and some of the iron in the water when it comes out, but that usually is when the salt level in our point of entry system has gotten low and we need to put some new salt in for the treatment of the water. All right, so Private Well Testing Act. Next thing is not everybody has natural gas to their house. Some people have oil, and you could have an oil tank in your basement. Some places you can have an oil tank in your backyard, not many. And then you can also have oil tanks underground. So there's nothing illegal about an underground oil tank. However, if you find a leak in an underground oil tank, there is a procedure that must be followed. And whenever I am buying a house myself, for myself, I always have an oil tank sweep done. and I'm looking to see if there's an underground oil tank. Only because if there is an underground oil tank, I want it removed before I buy the house. I don't want to buy a house with an underground oil tank. We have an underground storage tank law. Excuse me. That covers tanks that are 2,000 gallons and above. Tanks that are under 2,000 gallons aren't covered by the UST. However, if you're going to remove an oil tank, the process is you have to pull a permit, then they're going to come and excavate the underground oil tank, and then they're going to cut a flap in the tank. So you can see here's the flap cut in this tank, here's the flap cut in this tank, and here's the flap cut in this tank. These are all actual tanks that I had removed. You know, if you look carefully enough, this is me taking a picture. These are oil tanks, all tanks that I have had removed. Now, the first one leaked. So when they came in and they excavated it and they cut the flap, they could see that it leaked. They mark it as leak. And as soon as they mark it as leak, they report it to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. It creates a lien against the property. So the ownership of the property cannot be done until the leak is cleaned up. So in the one that leaked, what has to happen next is we have the tank carted away, and they take the tanks to incinerators and burn them up and melt them down. Sometimes they take them to Pennsylvania and crush them and put them into landfill. But lately they have been bringing them and melting them down. Then they have to remediate the soil where the leak was. And sometimes that means removing a couple inches of soil. They put it into those little blue barrels, and they take those blue barrels away and they take those to an incinerator usually. Sometimes the leak is substantial and the leak gets into the groundwater. When the leak gets into the groundwater, what has to happen is they put monitoring wells in, and they have to have 3 successive, they monitor the well on a monthly basis, and they have to have 3 successive no oil results in the monitors before you can move on and get the lien released. So whether it's dirt they're removing or whether it's groundwater monitors they're monitoring, once you have finished the remediation, then they have a geologist. You hire a geologist to come in, and the geologist gives you a letter of no further action. So the tank that says leaks was a leaker that ended up costing about $20,000 to remove the tank and do the remediation. The tank in the middle was not a leaker. It was $3,000 because it was a big tank to remove that tank. The tank on the right was not a leaker, but when they pulled it out, you can see they had to tear up the driveway. So now they have to refill the hole where the tank came out of after they get rid of the tank, and then put a new driveway in. So this is all stuff that there is no rule that says you have to do it. There's no rule that says the seller has to fix it. This is all by negotiation, whether you're going to be responsible for it or the seller is going to be responsible for it. My advice is to always make the seller responsible, get it out of there before you buy the house. We do have a house on William Street in South River that the remediation has been over $100,000 so far. And this is just a little tiny 3-bedroom house, $100,000 worth of remediation. So you would not want to buy a house and end up with you having to pay $100,000 for remediation. The next thing we have to worry about in environmental issues is asbestos. And asbestos is a mineral fiber. It's used for a number of purposes because it's a good heat shield. It keeps heat from transferring easily. So they use asbestos to wrap pipes in basements. They use asbestos on your brake shoes of your car, or at least they used to, because your brake shoes get really hot. They also use asbestos to make floor tiles to go on the floor of your basement because they're practically indestructible. And they use asbestos to make outside shingle tiles on houses built in the 1950s and 60s because it was practically indestructible. So those are types of asbestos. And what happens with asbestos is whether you break it into little pieces or whether it becomes friable. And this is a picture of friable asbestos. The asbestos wrapping around this pipe has started to come apart, and little fingers of fiber extend out, and molecules of the asbestos come off that finger of fiber, and you inhale it. And if you the radical shape of the molecule of the asbestos, when you inhale it into your lungs do not dissolve things. The rest of your body, you get a splinter, your body will dissolve it eventually, but your lungs do not dissolve things. So if you get a fiber of asbestos in your lungs, it stays in there forever and irritates the sacs, and eventually you could develop asbestosis, a form of cancer. Now, if you've got friable asbestos, you've got to have it removed by a licensed contractor. Again, it's no law that says you need to remove it. It's done by negotiation. Within the contract, you negotiate whether they're going to remove the asbestos. Typically, it's found by the home inspector. The way they remove it is they come and they spray everything with water to wet it down. That keeps the molecules from flying around. And then they remove it all. They typically paint the pipes after they've done removing it all with a very special color paint that seals in any tiny molecules that still might be left. And if we look at this particular picture here, here's what people do with asbestos that they think is correct, but it's not right. They have wrapped this pipe here with a aluminum foil tape. And some people, that's the old-fashioned way of thinking, the home handyman do-it-yourself remediation technique. But home inspectors will say, oh, nope, that's no good. That needs to be taken off, needs to be sprayed down with the water and then painted with that special sealing paint. And that paint is a very unique red color, and only licensed asbestos remediation companies can buy it. So what does it cost to remediate? If you got pipes like this in your basement covered with asbestos, it's going to be $2,500. Again, no law that says you have to do it. It's by negotiation between the seller and the buyer. And again, as you inhale those molecules of the asbestos, it could cause asbestos cancer, asbestitis, and that's because the molecules get in your lungs and they don't dissolve and they cause irritation to your lungs, and it could cause cancer. The next one is an interesting thing because it was thought to be a health hazard and it was made illegal. That's urea formaldehyde foam insulation. Then they revisited the science and they decided it's not a health hazard. This is a type of foam they spray in to insulate properties that it's otherwise too costly or too tough to insulate with the regular fiberglass insulation. And what this foam does is it fills your gaps between your studs. And sometimes if you've got a plaster and lath wall, there's no way for you to get behind the plaster and lath except to drill a hole in it and spray this stuff in. And it was at one point made illegal, and now it's legal again. But because it has this history of going from illegal to legal, sometimes home inspectors will bring it up as an issue, but it is not an issue, and it is not illegal, and there is no law that says you have to take it out. The next thing is carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide poisoning occurs when you're burning fossil fuels. That's gasoline, natural gas, kerosene, propane, whatever you happen to be burning, and it doesn't completely combust. So it's the incomplete combustion of these carbon-based fuel products, and the incomplete combustion causes carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless and lighter than air. And colorless and odorless means you can't smell it or see it. And it's lighter than air, which means it floats up. So what happens is you might produce carbon monoxide in your garage, like this guy did. He was running a generator in his garage because he had lost power. And when he was running the generator in the garage, it was not running correctly. So it was producing carbon monoxide. And one man died and several others were hospitalized after they were poisoned with carbon monoxide. and it's colorless and odorless, so you don't smell it or taste it. And you get to a certain level and you fall asleep and then you die. So it's happens every year in New Jersey. Usually it's from people burning generators in their garage, or sometimes it's from burning kerosene space heaters inside your house. How do we make sure we don't get carbon monoxide poisoning? We have carbon monoxide detectors. New laws on carbon monoxide detectors say they have to be the sealed battery kind, not the kind where you change the batteries, but the sealed battery kind. The new laws say they have to be younger than 10 years old. So when you call for your carbon monoxide detector inspection as part of your fire safety inspection, the inspectors check the dates. And if they're older than 10 years old, they flunk you on the test and you have to get a new one. All right, now we're going to talk about industrial type pollution. So we have some spaces in New Jersey that used to be dumps, the town dumps or waste disposal sites for factories. And there's a law that's called the Sanitary Landfill Facility Closure Act. And what that law says is that if you become aware that a property had previously been used as a waste disposal site, it is the obligation of the seller to notify and inform all buyers of the location and the use and the time frame that that property had been used as a sanitary landfill facility. And every municipality used to have a town dump, right? We don't have them anymore. We have the big one at Edgeboro Road, the transfer station, and we have another one down on, oh boy, I just forgot the name of the Howell Road in Monmouth Township, down in Neptune. So again, every town used to have one of these. We don't have so many of them anymore, but the sites are still there. And the obligation is to notify and inform. The seller needs to notify and inform the buyer of when it had been used as a sanitary landfill, what kind of sanitary landfill it was. The next thing is lead paint. Now, prior to 1978, we used leaded gasoline. You all know now, you go to get gas, it's unleaded. But prior to 78, you had your choice of leaded or unleaded. Leaded gasoline provide lubrication for your valves in older cars. So if you didn't have leaded gasoline, your car would wear out faster. 1978, they made it illegal and they had to engineer ways to protect your valve stems other than lead. Lead was also used in paint, and lead was a hardening agent, made the paint hard. And it also made it so it was hard to scuff up. It was hard to, you could always wash off discolorations on it. The most popular paint in New Jersey was Dutch Boy White Lead. And Dutch Boy White Lead, the company knew that lead paint was dangerous, especially dangerous to children. And the reason is lead paint itself has a semi-sweet taste. And it's so small of a sweetness that only children can really taste it. An adult, if you were to taste it, you wouldn't taste that it was sweet, but children did. And so children would eat lead paint chips or bite into windowsills. And sometimes, you'd go into a house and you'd see all these bite marks on the windowsills. That's because the kid had discovered if he bit on it, he would taste something sweet. So after 1978, they made lead paint illegal. We also use lead in certain kinds of solder for plumbing. We also use some lead pipes. We also use lead for the counterbalance weights in double hung sash windows. After 78, all of that was illegal. So what we have to do now is any house that was built prior to 1978, or any rental, we have to enclose a lead addendum. In the lead addendum, the seller states that he has no knowledge or no records of any lead, or that he does have knowledge and he does have records. And the seller also states that if he has no knowledge and no records and he finds out that he has lead, he'll let the buyer know. And then the buyer either takes the responsibility to do a lead paint assessment or waives the opportunity to do a lead paint assessment.
Bruce,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yeah. Mhm.
All right. In my apartment, when I signed my lease, they made me sign an acknowledgement of the fact that I knew that there was lead-based paints used in the apartment before I moved in there.
Right. So that's what this document we're talking about. And you could have said, no, I don't want to lease the apartment without doing a lead assessment. Now, you're in a bad position. You're trying to lease the apartment and you don't want to say, no, I don't want the apartment because it's been painted prior with lead. But you could have asked for the ability to do a lead assessment to see if there was any lead that really was an issue. Typically, if you've painted over the lead a number of times, it's not going to be an issue.
Now with the lead, unless you're going and like licking the walls like the kids like were doing, is there still some sort of, does it put off something that like
No.
is gonna hurt you?
No. Lead gasoline did, because you would be breathing in the results of the lead gasoline, but not lead paint. However, there are people who are very aware of lead and are sensitive to the idea of lead, and they don't want to have a house with lead. Now, there's a new law that's going into effect in July. And the new law says that every rental from now on has to be tested for lead. So you were given a paper that said, we probably had lead here in the past. That, you might have not really been comfortable with that. But the new law that's going into effect in July is every landlord is going to have to get a lead inspection of his property before sale or before rental. Not on rentals, not before sales, but on rentals. They're going to have to get a lead inspection done. And a lot of landlords, they get an inspection done where their unit is certified lead free. So once you get that certified lead free designation, then you don't have to get the every time between tenants lead test done. This is a brand new law, hasn't been put into effect yet, but it's going to make renting units, crazy, because now you've got another level of inspections you have to do. And I've been talking to home inspectors, and home inspectors are not going to be licensed to do lead inspections. You're going to have a special certification to do lead inspections. If you're so inclined, it might be worth investigating how to become a lead inspector, because every apartment is going to need to have a lead inspection. Absolutely a crazy law, but it's a law. There is a story about some of the science and some of the statistics created on the evidence and the damage of lead. And the name of the article is The Tooth Fairy. A dentist in New York was aware of the science that in children especially, their baby teeth absorb lead. And I don't know the exact reason they absorb lead. And so what he did was he started offering a silver dollar to every mother in New York City that would bring him a child's baby tooth that had fallen out. Just one per family, right? One per kid. You couldn't all get 32 of them when 32 of their teeth fell out. And then they evaluated all of the teeth that he got, and they discovered that, the amount of lead that was being ingested into kids was much higher than they originally thought. So again, it was fairly easy to say no more lead after 1978. Oh, by the way, if you rent a house or sell a house without this form and it was built prior to 1978, you are liable for a $10,000 fine from the federal government. So we don't want $10,000 fines. Here's what happens, and I've had this happen in 30 years. I've had the EPA one time come to my office. They were the people who were investigating lead. And they said to me, how many deals did your office do last year? And I remember it was 150. And they said, pull out 10% of your files. So that was, 10% of 150 was 15. And they went through every single file to see if the house had been built prior, every one of those 10%, to see if the house had been built prior to 1978. And then they checked to make sure I had all of the lead disclosures in the files that were pre-1978. And I was lucky, through my wife's good work and through my admin's good work, every single file had a lead disclosure in it that was supposed to, so I didn't get any fines. But if the forms were incorrectly filled out, and some were, they made me track down the buyers and sellers and get them to retroactively sign the form, which proved to be like a couple months worth of work, but it was still better than paying a $10,000 fine. The moral of the story is get those forms signed correctly. When you take a listing, You're going to have the seller sign his portion that says he has no knowledge and no lead. And you're going to upload that into your MLS. And then when a buyer's agent wants to make an offer on the property, he is going to download that form that's been signed by the seller already. And he's going to incorporate that into his contract package for his buyer. And then the buyer is going to sign the form and indicate whether he's going to do a lead assessment or waive his right to a lead assessment. So, it's one of those things that's a headache and you're always going to have to deal with it, but you don't want a $10,000 fine. Next is radon. And I have a radon test being done in Highland Park today. We dropped off the radon canister. Radon is a colorless, odorless, heavier than air gas. What does heavier than air mean? It doesn't float. So where do you find radon? On the floor of your basement, because it doesn't float. It gets pushed up through your basement floor because your basement floor is porous to some extent. Even though water might not penetrate, molecules of radon can. And it gets pushed up through the pressure that's in the soil from hydrostatic pressure or from barometric pressure. On really, really dry days where the air is heavy, you might have a little higher level of radon than on really wet days when the air is really light. And there is no law that says you have to fix radon. It's negotiation between the seller and the buyer. No law that says you have to fix radon. And what typically happens is if you find radon, this property in Highland Park, they're testing for radon tomorrow. It's being tested now. They leave the canister. It's a charcoal canister. They leave in the basement for a minimum of 3 days. Then they mail it out and they measure how much radioactivity it's absorbed. And the level of acceptance is 4 picocuries per liter or less. 4 picocuries per liter or less. So the radon, these are the yellow arrows. They get pushed up through the floors. The way a radon remediation system works is they dig a hole in your floor and they put, some kind of a liner in it. And now it's lower than the floor of your basement. So all the radon that's in your basement flows into the canister. And then they have one of these fans that sucks it out of the canister and disperses it outside into your yard. The acceptable level of radiation from radon is 4 picocuries per liter. Picocuries are named after Madame Curie, who discovered radiation and died from playing around with radiation eventually. One of our top women scientists, by the way. So 4 picocuries per liter, that's a relatively low level. And I would say probably 1 out of every 8 houses has a high level of radon. No law, again, that says you have to fix it. It's done by negotiation between the seller and the buyer. I have seen houses that have 0 levels of radon, and I have seen houses that had 80 picocuries per liter level of radon. I'd be myself a little nervous if I had a house that had 80 picocuries per liter. I've also seen people who put a radon detection device on the 2nd floor of a condo during a home inspection, which is insanity, because you would never have radon that was going all the way up to the 2nd floor of a building because it's heavier than air. Why do they put it there? Because they charge you extra for the radon test. So they get to make a couple extra dollars. The next thing we want to talk about is electromagnetic fields. Those are the high tension wires that pass behind your property. We talked about those last night in appraising, and they are not a proven health hazard. But what they are is external obsolescence. And the house in the middle here, the ranch, I was doing a broker's price opinion on, not an appraisal because I'm not an appraiser, but I had to factor in the fact that these high tension wires in the backyard there reduce the value of this house by somewhere between 10 to 15% because of external obsolescence. Electromagnetic fields are not a proven health hazard in the United States, but I will tell you that in Denmark, they are considered a health hazard. And in Denmark, your producer of electromagnetic fields that you don't even think about is your cell phone. Your cell phone is always producing electromagnetic fields. And electromagnetic fields have an inverse squared relationship to distance. So they don't have a direct correlation to distance. Instead, they have an arithmetic correlation, a geometric correlation to distance, which means if you're twice as far away, it's only 1/4 as powerful. If you're 10 times away, it's only 1/100th as powerful. But in Denmark, they believe you shouldn't keep your cell phones in your pockets, especially for men, because there's cells nearby that may be damaged by the electromagnetic fields. In the United States, though, we don't believe that electromagnetic fields are a health hazard. The next one is mold. Mold is an organism that grows in the presence of moisture and then in the absence of airflow and light. Mold, again, if you have it, it's a negotiation between the seller and the buyer to find out if they're going to remediate for it. So mold, like we're seeing here, the way you remediate it is he is spraying this with a solution of 1 part bleach to 50 parts water, and that kills the mold. He may go back later on and spray with a moldicide or a fungicide, but the only way to keep the mold away is to remove the source of water. You might have a leak in that building. You might need to put a dehumidifier in the building, but the only way to keep the mold away is by making sure the moisture is gone. And there is no, yes,
That's drywall, correct?
that's drywall. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm saying, could you theoretically just cut out the bad drywall where the mold is after you repair the leak and just replace the drywall with new fresh drywall to have less of a chance of mold returning?
That's the way smart people do it.
That's
And-
what I would do.
Usually you're going to find the mold on the floor, along the floor, not along a ceiling junction like that. And, you know, typically what they'll do is they'll cut 4 feet out all the way around on the floor. Why 4 feet? Because it's 1 sheet of sheetrock, right? You turn a sheetrock on its side and it's 4 feet all the way around. And you'll be surprised how quickly mold can grow. They say that if you have a flood, like a pipe burst or it rains, and you have a carpet in your basement, if that carpet is wet for 3 days, you've created yourself a major mold situation. So you've got to act very quickly when things get wet and to remove the moisture. All right, this is a industrial law, not a homeowner law. This is CERCLA, CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. And this was an act that was, again, not a regulatory statute, but it's a cleanup and liability law. Who's responsible for cleaning things up? And unfortunately, this law made everybody in the chain of ownership of a property responsible for the cleanup. Everybody in the chain of ownership, which is sometimes unfair. It cleans up abandoned or orphaned toxic sites by imposing strict cleanup liability on those parties responsible for creating them and everybody in the chain of ownership. So in 1986, they modified the law with SARA, S-A-R-A, the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. That extended and amended CERCLA, and it lists extremely hazardous chemicals that must be reported to authorities whenever sold or released. But the major thing it does is it added third-party immunity. And third-party immunity is if the pollution was caused by a third party and not you, if you acquired the property after it was polluted, so, 20 years after it was polluted, you bought it. The owner did not know of the problem. So the guy who sold it to you did not know of the problem and you didn't know of the problem. And you exercised due care to determine if there was a hazardous waste and you missed it. So if all those things happen, you would have what was called innocent landowner immunity. And then you would be absolved of the responsibility of being in that chain of cleanup that CERCLA created. So that's SARA, Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. The next thing is ISRA, the Industrial Site Recovery Act. Every commercial and business endeavor is given a ISRA code. And that ISRA code is administered through the Department of Community Affairs in Trenton. So a gas station might have a code of, L7. And that means that if you sell a gas station, you're going to have to do an environmental study. if you sell a hotel, I sold a hotel in Perth Amboy. That has an R1 code, which means there's no chance it had caused any pollution, so you don't need to do an environmental study. Now, the hotel I sold in Perth Amboy on Smith Street was only a block away from a gas station I sold in Perth Amboy. The hotel had no pollution. The IRSA code said we didn't have to do a study. The gas station said it probably does have pollution. We do have to do a study, and we found significant pollution. So when you are listing or dealing with an industrial property or a commercial property, you want to find out what the ISRA code is, and then that will dictate to you whether or not you have to do an environmental study. The next thing is in New Jersey, we've passed a lot of anti-development laws, and this is always on the test, this specific question. We have the Highlands Act, the Pinelands Act, the Wetlands Act, all these different laws in New Jersey to stop the development of environmentally sensitive areas. You know, it's one of the reasons that land is so expensive in New Jersey is there's so much of it we can't build on, and we're a small state anyway. So the question on the test is, what's the purpose of these environmental laws? It's to stop the overdevelopment of environmentally sensitive areas. And you can see in the Pinelands, this is a big area that's not able to be developed. And one of the reasons is, and I think we've mentioned this word before, there's a giant aquifer underneath all this area, a giant lake of super clear water that goes back, you know, thousands of years. That's a good natural resource to have those millions and millions of gallons of water right underneath the surface in Pinelands. Excuse me. So when you get your real estate license, you are going to have to be aware of environmental issues. And we do have a responsibility to try to keep things clean. If somebody is doing something that's environmentally illegal or insensitive, we sort of have a responsibility to make sure it gets stopped. And we have an obligation to our clients, our sellers and our buyers to, you know, give them advice that they need to be concerned about certain issues. Somebody says, should I worry about oil tanks underground? My typical answer is I would. If somebody says, should I buy this house even though the lead paint thing says that, you know, that they have knowledge if there's lead? And I'd say, well, you might want to check with somebody who's a specialist and see what the level of lead is. If you have a radon test that comes out at 5 picocuries per liter and the acceptable level is 4, and they said, should I worry about 5 picocuries per liter as opposed to 4? Again, you know, your advice to them is, why don't you talk to somebody who's an expert in it, because you don't want to tell them not to worry about it, and then 20 years later they turn up with lung cancer and want to sue you for the radon poisoning. All right. So that's most of the questions that you're going to have on the test that kind of apply to environmentals. Now, the next chapter in the book is how to get the highest score. And we talked about a little bit the other night. My recommendation on how to get the highest score is to listen in class, but also to take your book and go through the end of the chapters and do the quizzes, see how you did. In the back of the book, there's sample broker's test and sample salesperson's test. I'd recommend you play with those to some extent. In the quizzes, and today I sent everybody a Word doc with a lot of the quizzes on it and a lot of the YouTube videos on it. I would recommend you take as many of the quizzes as possible. Yes.
I did not get that email with the.
Okay. What I would ask you to do is send me a text now, and I will email it to you as soon as we finish with class tonight, the document with those, the Word doc with those tests and the YouTubes on it. But text me your email now, so I'll make sure I do it tonight. We're getting closer to following everybody's advice, and on our bestschoolofrealestate.biz website, bestschoolofrealestate.biz, we're going to take, somebody gave me the advice here of, I want to make sure that I label all of the YouTube videos, what chapter they are and what subject they are. So we're doing that, and we're going to put them all onto our webpage, our website, so that you could just go on and pick any one you want off of it and watch any one you want and take any test you want. I think that'll make it a lot easier for everybody and not having to depend on me to get back to you. And again, I apologize that sometimes I can't get back to you right away because like on tonight's class, when I click off on tonight's class, my Zoom is going to process the video for about an hour and a half. And then I have to upload it into YouTube, and that takes a little while. So I don't really have access to my computer for, let's say, 2 hours once I start the process. So again, this might make it easier for everybody. And we made significant progress today. We should have all that stuff up and running within a couple of days. And you'll be able to just go on the bestschoolofrealestate.biz website. You'll go on to the page that says test or the page that says videos and just click on whatever test or whatever video you want to watch. I think it's going to work out really well. And that's from using your guys' suggestions. So I always appreciate your guys' suggestions. And the website is, it's not up and the website is up and running right now. Having the YouTubes and the class tests on it, probably going to be a couple more days. And it's Best School of Real Estate.biz. I'm putting it right now into the chat so that you can all see it. But we only have one test on there now. We just testing the test to see if it works. We're making a couple other changes to the tests, by the way. The tests are now going to email you your results. You can look at the test when you're done and see what the answers are, which is always a good idea, but it will email your results, and it's emailing me immediately your scores so that I don't have to go in and look up your scores. I can see when you took the test and what your score was. That'll help me again know what I have to do to get you guys to pass. So hopefully we'll have that up and running in a couple of more days. Now,
Bruce?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Did you say you sent out the Word document today, like simultaneously with the link to this class?
No, I sent it out in a separate email right after.
Did everybody else get it? I'm just curious.
So
I didn't get it.
I didn't get it.
I will try it
I
again.
didn't get it.
I will try it again in a few minutes. Make
Thank
sure
you.
you check your junk folders.
I just did, yeah.
Yeah, this is one of the problems when I send out 100 emails a day all at once. Sometimes my email, my MSN doesn't allow me to send out more than 100 a day. That's why we're trying to solve this by having everything on this website, so I don't have to depend on the email getting through. Instead, we can just click it off the website. But I'll try again tonight when we finish class. I'll send out the document again. It's a Word document. I don't think it's going to be a clickable link. You'll have to cut and paste onto your browser the different links. And we'll try it again. But like I said, in a couple of days, we'll have all the stuff right on the website, and it'll make it much easier. I don't have to depend on 100 emails a day limit from MSN. All right. So taking the test. You're gonna take the sample test. You're gonna take my test. You're gonna listen in class. You're going to not be stressed. If you don't pass the test, you just take it again. And we look at report cards. And when we look at report cards, it's one of the ways that we determine what we can do to help you do better. Here's a report card. Okay. So when I look at this report card, you need a 77 to pass because there's 110 questions. I can see, for instance, that on property ownership, this person did good. On land use controls and regulations, they need a little help. But look, on the chapter on appraising, which is valuation and market analysis, they only got 1 out of 6. So I know that this person needs to, we need to do the appraisal chapter again. They got 5 out of 8 on financing, which is a really good score. They got 3 out of 10 on general principles of agency, which means they don't understand who's a client and who's a customer. They got 2 out of 5 on required property disclosures. And I have a class on required property disclosures that we'll review, not tonight, but we'll review it because I do see people getting lower grades on this. And that's because it's a cross-chapter category. For instance, we learned tonight that what's a property disclosure you need? You need the lead paint disclosure. What's another one? You need the Private Well Testing Act disclosure. What's another one? Well, in the chapter on contracts, you need the opinion 26. What's the other one? You need the consumer information statement. What's another one? You need a seller's disclosure from a different chapter. So this is a tough one because it's a cross chapter kind of answer, different answers. On contracts, they got 8 out of 14. So a little bit of help on contracts. On leasing and property management, 1 out of 2. On transfer of title, 3 out of 6. And here's on chapter 3, which is the hardest chapter, they got 7 out of 11, which is a good score. And they had 8 math questions on their test. They got 3 correct. That's a good score. On statutes, again, that's chapter 3 again, 13 out of 22. So that means chapter 3 was a very important chapter. And additional requirements, 0 out of 3. Additional requirements has to do with your continuing ed. We know you need 12 hours of continuing ed every 2 years. And 6 of it has to be required courses and 6 of it has to be electives. So when somebody doesn't pass and they send me their report card, I can kind of evaluate what we need to help them. So this person, the first thing we would do is we would work over on chapter 3. The second thing we would do was we would get up here where they had 1 on 6 on the appraisal chapter. That's too easy of a chapter to only get 1 out of 6 correct on. And that's the way we help you get past. Yes.
Quick question. So I'm a teacher. Every year we have to do 20 hours of professional development, whether it's webinars or whatever. Is that what you're saying about the 12-hour requirement for every 2 years?
Every 2 years as a real estate agent, if you have a regular real estate agent's license, not a referral license, you have to do 12 hours of continuing ed.
So would that be considered like real estate webinars, or would we have to attend a seminar, or how does that work? Or like
all different ways. Those you're allowed to do completely online from the computer with not a live instructor. You're also, a lot of people give free classes, like title insurance companies will give a free class for an hour's credit. And home inspection companies will give a free class for an hour's credit. I give classes on foreclosures and on short sales for 6 hours credits, on things like how to create contracts. That's another 1 credit course.
Do we have to pay for these courses to maintain them, or are they free?
Some are free, some you have to pay for, some are people inviting you for free to take the class so that they can talk you into buying their home inspection services, perhaps. You guys will not need your 12 hours of continuing ed this license cycle because this class will count as your 12 hours. So you'll be able to get your license this year, which is 2022, and you'll be able to renew your license on June 30th of 2023 without taking any continuing ed because this class will have counted for it. Now from 7/1, yes.
Oh, but then if we would have needed the 12, it has to be done by April 30th. Is that what it is?
Or they fine you.
Got it.
They fine you $200. You could do it up to the last minute, but if you don't have it done by April the 30th, they fine you $200. Okay. All right, so you're going to have 6 questions on property ownership probably. And that's things like tenants in common, joint tenants with rights of survivorship, tenants by the entirety, condos and co-ops. Those are easy ones. 4 questions on land use controls and regulations, like zoning and planning and Private Well Testing Act. 6 questions on the chapter on appraisals. 8 questions on financing. Probably 2 of those will be math because there's financing questions that are math. General principles of agency, you'll have 10 questions. Who's a client? Who's a customer? What do you owe to a client? You owe them old car. What do you owe to a customer? You owe them honesty. If you're going to represent both a buyer and a seller in a transaction, that makes you a disclosed dual agent. And if you're a disclosed dual agent, you have to have informed consent to dual agency in writing. And then they'll ask questions about what's the best way to terminate an agency relationship. And we know that the best way to terminate an agency relationship is accomplishment of the objective. Then you'll have required property disclosures. We talked about the lead disclosure, the seller's disclosure, the consumer information disclosure. All those are required property disclosures. Contracts, 14 questions. So a lot of questions on contracts. What's a unilateral contract? What's a bilateral contract? What are the essential elements of a contract? What happens if we breach a contract? All questions that would show up on contracts. Leasing and property management, that's only 2 questions. The big one is a property manager is a general agent. They have a broad range of responsibility over a long period of time. And a property manager in order to become a property manager, you have to have a property manager's agreement. And the most important thing in the property manager's agreement is to spell out your fiduciary duties. You'll also have an operating agreement that says how you're going to operate as your property manager. Transfer of title, that's going to be when we talk about the chapter on deeds and what are the essential elements of a deed and different types of deeds, like a sheriff's deed or a quitclaim deed. Which kind of a deed do you not even say you're the owner? Well, we know a quitclaim deed has no covenant of season, so we're not even saying we're the owner. Practice of real estate. This is about contracts and about leases and about everything generally. And it's about who can you get payment from? Only your employing broker. Who can pay you? Any monies that come into you, what do you have to do with it? You have to give it to your employing broker. Who can have a trust account? Only your employing broker. Where does that trust account have to be? Has to be an approved institution. What's conversion? Conversion is when the broker puts his money into the trust account. Those type of questions. 6 questions on real estate math. And remember, we saw the report card, that person had 8 questions, but usually 6 questions is 4 to 6 is what you get. I don't believe these are hard questions. I believe that we kind of go over all of the type of questions that come up on these 6 questions. Duties and powers of the Real Estate Commission. And remember, the Real Estate Commission is part of the Department of Banking and Insurance. The Real Estate Commission's job is to set the rules and regulations that apply to real estate license law. And real estate license law is Title 45, Chapter 15. That's the name of real estate license laws. There's 8 commissioners. One of them is appointed as the executive director. They serve as 2-year terms. 5 are people who have been licensed as a broker for 10 years. 2 are members of the general public, and 1 serves at the pleasure of the governor. Licensing requirements: 18, high school education, 75-hour class, pass the test, get fingerprinted, be sponsored by a broker. For a broker, 150 hours of class, 3 years of experience full-time immediately preceding your application as a broker, get fingerprinted again, pay $20 into the guarantee fund. By the way, a salesperson puts $10 into the guarantee fund. Those are your licensing requirements, typical questions. This is the one that people have trouble with, and that's that Chapter 3. All the rules and regulations. What are the advertising regulations? What does your business card have to say? What sign has to be on an office? The sign that has to be on an office has to indicate that it is a licensed real estate agency and that the broker of record is who. So on my office, it says Remax Best Realty, broker of record, Bruce Parker. That's the requirement of the signage that's on a real estate office. In terms of your name on your business card, your name has to be exactly as it appears on your license. So if your name is John Peterson, one of my friends who came through all my salesperson's class and my broker's class, his name is John Peterson. On his business cards, everybody in the whole world calls him Jack. So he has to have John and then Jack in parentheses and then Peterson. On your business card, what can you call yourself? You can call yourself a real estate salesperson, a sales associate. And then additional requirements for licensing. That'll be about the continuing education. It'll be about how many hours you can work. Remember, if you're going to become a broker, you have to be employed 3 years full-time immediately preceding your application with no more than 20 hours in any other job. Okay, and those are basically the rundown of what's going to be on the test in terms of questions. All right, now I do want to go over our tests that we sent out today, and that was included with the invitation for class tonight. So let's just hit this test gently. And this is the test on appraising. I got some people who took it today and got hundreds on it, which I'm always like to see. All right, so I'm going to ask now if everybody can see appraising question 1 of 14. Can we see?
Yes.
Okay, good. We did good so far then. You notice we started getting the best school of real estate as a header on these questions. Slowly but surely, we're learning all the things we need to learn how to make this stuff look better and perform better. All right, so the economic characteristics of value or dust: demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Those are the economic characteristics of value: demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. 2, the 3 methods of value that an appraiser uses. And remember, we use the cost approach, the comparable sales approach, and the income approach. So comparable sales, cost, and income. Comparable sales are for single-family homes. Cost approach is for a church or a unique building. Income approach is for an apartment complex or a strip mall. The formula for the income approach is the value is equal to the NOI divided by the cap rate. That's the formula for the income approach. Value is equal to NOI divided by cap rate. Now, there is a rule of thumb. You know what a rule of thumb is? It's not a formula that's perfect. There is a rule of thumb called the gross rent multiplier. And the gross rent multiplier says you take the gross rent of a building and you multiply it by some factor, some multiplier, and that gives you the value. That is not as accurate as value by income, which is the NOI divided by the cap rate, because the gross rent multiplier does not take into consideration extraordinary expenses. And when we did my example the other night of the oil tank in that building in South Amboy, that's what made that building worth less money, was that the owner was paying for the heat, and it was an old-fashioned, beat-up, dilapidated oil system. So if you did the gross rent multiplier, it would look like the building was worth a lot more because it didn't take into account extraordinary expenses. The most appropriate method of valuation for an apartment building is the income approach. There is a synonym for the income approach, and it's called the capitalization approach. So the income approach or the capitalization approach are the same thing. Question number 5, the most appropriate method for valuation of a church is the cost approach. Church shouldn't have income unless you're counting bingo, and there's not a lot of comparable sales. Although, when you read statistics of how many churches are being sold, because churches are no longer have congregations large enough to support the churches, and more importantly, a lot of churches have endowments that support them. And the problem is interest rates are so low that the return on the endowments isn't able to support the churches, and they have to eat into their principal, which kind of snowballs the effect because now they have less principal getting a low interest rate. And so that brings them even less income, which means they have to eat into more principal. So we see a lot of churches being sold. I dealt with a couple of churches in Perth Amboy that were being sold, and other churches in Carteret. In 2021, the supply of homes was at a record low. In 2022, it's even worse because of the low supply. What happens to prices? So the supply of homes was low, prices increased. Supply and demand. Number 7, sometimes an apartment building, an estimated value not as accurate as the income approach, uses the annual rent times a multiple. And this method is what we talked about a minute ago. It's the gross rent multiplier. Number 8, the first step in the appraisal process is to define the problem. Define the problem. Why am I doing the appraisal? In the cost approach, if we are considering an exact duplicate, we're trying to use the method where we consider an exact duplicate. We are going to use the reproduction cost. Replacement cost would be for a similar building that has similar utility, but current materials and current building techniques. On my church in New Brunswick, they were using reproduction costs. My church wanted that value because it gave us a higher value because we wanted them to exactly reproduce our 1812 version of our church. In the income approach, which factor is not used? So what don't we use in the income approach? We know we don't use mortgage payments because how much you owe on a property has no relationship to what it is worth to me. Number 11, in the conformity principle of value, having the largest home in the neighborhood may be an example of, and it's regression. You think that just because you have the nicest home in the neighborhood, it should be worth more than everybody else's. But that's not really what happens. The other homes bring down your value. So that's an example of regression. Number 12, in the cost approach, the three types of accrued depreciation are all of the following except. So which don't we consider in accrued depreciation? We don't consider book value. We consider wear and tear. We consider functional obsolescence. That's how outdated or outmoded something is. And we consider external obsolescence. That's like the high tension wires, the loss of value from outside sources. Number 13, in the comparable sales method, the subject has 3 bedrooms. The most recent home has 4 bedrooms. And we're saying a bedroom is worth $5,000. So what adjustment do we make? Well, remember, rule number 1 is never touch the subject. So we're going to not do anything to the subject. That eliminates answers A and C because rule number 1 is never touch the subject. So that eliminates A and C. And the rules are I for I, increase for inferior, and S for S, subtract for superior. So our comparable is S, is superior because it has 4 bedrooms. So we S for S, we subtract for superior. So we're going to subtract $5,000 from the comparable sale. And 14, the most applicable method to value a church is the cost approach. Okay, so we got them all right. And now the way I hopefully have this set up is it would send me an email giving me my score, and then send me an email giving me my score as the instructor so that I can keep track. We are working on the final exam, by the way, on the final exam test, the 110 question test. We're working on it, having generate you a certificate for passing the test, which is a nice idea because I know that test is 110 questions long. Sometimes it takes 2-3 hours to do. And it's nice to get a symbol of your achievement by passing the test. It's nice to get your real estate license too, because there's crazy things happening. This business in Ukraine has sort of shaken people's confidence that good things are happening, and that slows the real estate market sometimes. We have inflation getting ready to really be rough, be high levels of inflation. Sometimes that scares off the real estate business, but it also adds to the value of real estate. So if you own real estate and you have inflation and the value of that real estate goes way up, in some respects, that's good. We may have interest rates going up. That's something to be concerned with because interest rates going up may cause a negative effect on prices, but we'll see. This is very, very strange circumstances that we have never had before. We'll see what's going to happen as we move into the future. All right, so that's the quiz. And we got a little bit more time tonight, so let's do one more thing. We're going to go to the vocabulary section here, and I need your guide.
I have
Yeah,
a quick question.
go
The
ahead.
recording from this class and last class, are you going to set that up on the website, or you're going to email it to us?
So we're going to email them to you, but again, like I said, I won't get to processing these probably until the weekend because they take so much, I won't be, the downloading of my tonight's class is going to take an hour on Zoom before I can touch my
Do you
computer
have
again.
any old recordings
Sure.
from chapters
Sure.
18?
Yep.
20,
Yep.
21?
Yep.
Please email us. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Also, sometimes on the class, we talk about things that my wife says I shouldn't put on the internet because they're there forever. So sometimes when people ask a personal question during the class or they identify themselves, then I shouldn't include that. So sometimes that makes it so my recording is not usable. But we're working on solving that. So first of all, can we see the first slide that says vocabulary?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to hope they change. All right, so the first slide is adjustable rate mortgage. What's an adjustable rate mortgage? It's where the rate adjusts.
It didn't
And-
change.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So the slide should say adjustable rate mortgage.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank you very much. So an adjustable rate mortgage, the amount of interest that you, the borrower, pay is based on an index plus a margin. The index is going to be something like the cost of funds rate, the London interbank offering rate, the prime interest rate, one of those indexes plus a margin. And what's the purpose of adjustable rate mortgages? It's because you're going to get a lower interest rate in the beginning. And since you get a lower interest rate in the beginning, it's easier for you to qualify for your loan with the front end ratio or the back end ratio, because your interest payments will be lower because you have a lower interest rate. What's the negative part of an adjustable rate loan? Well, we will see in the next couple of years as interest rates spike because of what's going on now. So people might have an adjustable rate loan now that's only charging them 2.5% interest. But when interest rates go up because of what's going on now, they might be paying 6%. And that's one of the things that exacerbated 2005 through 2008's housing crash. So, we never learn from history.
Bruce,
Yes.
why would anyone in their right mind use a variable rate mortgage and not a fixed rate? I mean, fixed rate, you know what you're going to pay over the 30 years, and variable, you don't know what you're going to pay due to the market interest rate.
Here's what the salesperson will tell you. Listen, you want to buy a more expensive house than you can afford. If we go to a adjustable rate loan, you'll be able to qualify for the loan. And don't worry, because you're only going to live there for a couple of years anyway, and then you're going to sell it and move on. And people get that in their head, because it used to be the average people only stayed in a house for 7 years. It's higher now. It's about 8.5 years. But, you've got people like me who buy a house and you're staying in, both houses that I've lived in for at least 25 years each. So, you want to buy a house. More expensive houses are nicer than less expensive houses. So you want your chance to live in a more expensive house and you're willing to take the gamble. They'll also tell you could always redo your interest rate later on. But what they don't tell you, if you take an adjustable rate loan and interest rates go up, the long-term rate is going to be high also. And
Also, from the time you refinance or renegotiate the interest rate, you'd be extending the length of the loan, correct?
right. So not a good idea.
No.
I've got a comment here from Milano saying people aren't informed enough. And I actually believe that's the case. And I believe that in the last 2005 through 2008, your mortgage people were paid higher commissions on crummier loans. So if they could initiate a loan like an adjustable rate loan that was really going to end up hurting you in the long run, they got paid a higher commission. Part of the banking reform laws that went into place after 2008, they stopped that so that the loan mortgage brokers or the mortgage lenders weren't incentivized to get you to take a more expensive a loan that would in the long run be more expensive to you and would make them more money up front.
They also don't tell you that it's better if you get a shorter loan, like 15 years as opposed to 30.
Absolutely.
Because, people always say, oh, if I do 30, I'm going to be paying such little mortgage. But at the end, you're paying twice for your house
Right.
because the interest is so high and you're hardly paying anything into the principal.
Yep.
Right, that's correct. But if you go with the 15 or 20-year mortgage, you're going to be paying a higher monthly rate each month, and maybe people can't afford that, correct?
So the answer is everybody has the right to make their own decision based on what their life circumstances are. And so the comment that somebody made that the only thing I can complain about is if people aren't informed and they're making a decision based on being uninformed. Everybody has the right to make whatever decision they want, but we have to make sure they're correctly informed and truthfully informed. Part of the Truth in Lending Act, by the way, and the revision of the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act was to eliminate bait and switch advertising in terms of loans. Because what would happen to people is somebody would think they were getting a loan that was at 4%, fully fixed, fully amortized. And then just before closing, they would tell them, oh, you're not eligible for that loan. We're going to have to switch you to an adjustable rate loan, but don't worry, you could still close. And the people would, they're not going to say, okay, forget it, I'm not buying a house. And they would go ahead and go with the adjustable rate loan. And so part of the revisions to the Truth in Lending Act requiring a 3-day cooling off period if they make a change. Part of that was exactly there to stop lenders from doing that. And you got to remember, not everybody is honest. Not everybody is doing what's in your best interest, even if they have a duty. Some people aren't doing that. All right, appraisals. Remember, you're going to go to the bank to get an appraisal. The bank is estimating its worst case scenario. What happens if they have to take the house back if you get foreclosed? And we looked at last night, the way you do an appraisal. And the appraisal is used to help to determine the loan to value ratio, because we're using the loan amount divided by the sales price or the appraised value, whichever is lower. And again, what's the purpose of using whichever is lower, the sales price or the appraised value? That's a weird question that pops up on the test, because I don't believe they have any business asking a question that makes you kind of assume what somebody else is thinking. But the answer is because buyers tend to want to overpay for a house. So they use whichever one of those two is lower. Assessed value is how much your public assessor is charging you in assessed dollars. And we know from the chapter on taxes that the equalization ratio converts your assessed valuation to your market value. So for instance, we talked about how South River is at 28%. So if your house is worth $100,000 in real dollars, it's assessed at $28,000. But then that $28,000 times South River's tax rate gives you the taxes. So your assessed value gives you an idea of what your taxes are going to be. And remember, your assessed value on your house is made up of two parts. One part is the land assessment, and the other part is the improvement assessment. Buyer's agent is somebody who represents the buyer. And so if you're a buyer's agent, the buyer is your client and you owe the buyer old car, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accountability, reasonable care, and diligence. And if you're a buyer's agent, you owe the seller only honesty, because the seller is a customer, which means you only owe them honesty. If you're a buyer's agent, the buyer is your client, which means you owe them a fiduciary duty. Closing refers to the meeting that takes place when the sale of the property is finalized. There are actually, when you buy a house, there's two closings. There's the mortgage closing. That's when the promissory note and the mortgage go from the purchaser to the bank. And then there's the closing of title, where the grantor signs the deed and transfers the deed to the grantee. And remember, there is an obligation for the seller's agent to let the IRS know that there was a real estate closing. So the IRS could potentially charge any capital gains taxes. Comparable market analysis is what we do as part of an appraisal. It's what we use for things like houses in a development. And again, we use the comparative market analysis using the principle of substitution. Something is only worth what something can be easily substituted in its place for. And our three methods of value in an appraisal are comparable sales method, income approach, and cost approach. Contracts have contingencies. Contingency means that you must satisfy something in order for the deal to proceed. So we have inspection contingencies for the home inspection. We have mortgage contingencies, which state that if the buyer in good faith applies for a mortgage and gets denied, that they can, in fact, get out of the deal. We also have sometimes appraisal contingencies. If we pay $300,000 for a house and it only appraises at 275, we might not have to buy it. Those are contingencies. Those are conditions that must be met in order for the deal to go through. Dual agency is when one real estate agent represents both the buyer and the seller. And in order to have informed consent dual agency, to make dual agency legal, you have to have informed consent to dual agency. Now, here is the tricky part of this. It doesn't necessarily have to be one agent representing both the buyer and the seller. What it really has to be is an agent from your company representing the seller, and then another agent from your company representing the buyer. Now you're dual agents. And why are you dual agents? Because both of you who work for the company are sub-agents of the broker. So it is really the broker who is representing both the buyer and the seller. And you're a sub-agent of the broker. And since you both work in that broker's office, even though this guy might represent the seller and this guy might represent the buyer, you're both in the broker's office. So you are dual agents. And in order to be dual agents, you must have informed consent to dual agency in writing. Otherwise, it's an uninformed dual agency, undisclosed dual agency, and it's a violation of real estate commission rules. Equity is the amount of value you have in your house after the mortgage is paid off. So in this case, you have a $200,000 home and you owe $150,000 on it. Your amount of equity is $50,000. Sometimes you'll hear of a home equity loan. And in this case, the house is worth $200,000. He owes $150,000 on it. He's got $50,000 in equity. Another lender might lend him $25,000. And that lender would be in second position, while this $150,000 lender would be in first position. And that would make this a home equity loan. You're giving a loan on the equity in the home. Fixed rate mortgage. And a fixed rate mortgage is a mortgage where the rate remains the same. A fixed rate fully amortized loan is a loan where the loan remains the same for the entire time. And at the end of the time frame, you have paid off the entire principal balance. A home warranty is a warranty that is offered to protect the appliances and the air conditioning unit. The question on the test about home warranties is if you are going to advertise a home warranty as being available on a house, you must state who's paying for it, because a home warranty is available on every house. But is the seller paying for the home warranty or is the buyer paying for the home warranty? So interest is the cost of borrowing money, and the interest is the income that the lender is generating from the business of lending you money. And we're always going to say that the interest that you earn on a loan, the interest that you earn is equal to the principal balance of the loan times the rate of interest. The interest is equal to the principal balance of the loan times the rate of interest. A mortgage broker. So we're going to differentiate between a mortgage banker and a mortgage broker. A mortgage broker is an individual or company who puts borrowers and lenders together, not lending out their own money, but puts borrowers and lenders together. That's a mortgage broker. A mortgage banker is someone who lends out their own money. The difference between a banker and a broker is not lending out their own money. A banker, a mortgage banker, is lending out their own money. Principal is the amount of money that you are generating income off of when you multiply it by the rate of interest. private mortgage insurance, PMI, is what you have to pay to a insurance company if you have a conventional loan, and that PMI that you pay to the insurance company makes the lender whole again if you get foreclosed. So if you default on your loan, it gets foreclosed, the lender sells the house at the auction and they lose $100,000. The PMI company writes a check to the lender for $100,000. When you get that loan that you put down less than 20%, in order to have PMI, you're going to pay premiums. Every month, you're going to pay a PMI premium. A realtor, this is one of the questions they always tell me in our seminars once every 2 years of things they're not happy with how we're training, is that a realtor is not necessarily a real estate agent. And a realtor is somebody who is a real estate agent who has joined the National Association of Realtors. The National Association of Realtors is a trade group. The National Association of Realtors has a logo. You cannot use that logo unless you belong to the realtors. And the National Association of Realtors has a code of ethics that you must adhere to. The biggest benefit of the National Association of Realtors is they're a lobbying group because they're the second largest trade association in the country. So they lobby for things. Another advantage of the realtors is if there is a commission dispute between agents from different firms and you are both realtor offices, then the National Association of Realtors has a mediation and arbitration system for settling those disputes, because the real estate commission will never get involved between commission disputes between agents from competing companies. The American Land Title Association is kind of like the realtors for title insurance agents. Amortization means that you're going to pay off the principal. It comes from the French word for death because you're going to pay off the debt by the time you're done. APR is the annual percentage rate under the Truth in Lending Act, specifically administered through Regulation Z.
Bruce, it's staying on the Alta slide right now.
Okay, thank you. Back hopefully to APR. It's required by Regulation Z in the Truth in Lending Act. You have to disclose what the annual percentage rate is as a percentage of the interest rate paid. And the APR that's disclosed in Regulation Z is not only your nominal interest rate, which means the interest rate you're getting on the loan, it's also the costs that are involved in originating a loan. So for instance, if you're getting a 4% loan, but you're paying 1 point, then the APR is going to be 4 1/8, because each point is 1/8 of an interest, 1/8 of a percentage. All right, so we still be on the APR slide. Now we should be on chain of title slide. When you do a title search, the person doing the title search is going to prepare an abstract of title. That's a report on everything that pertains to that specific property. And then one of the things they're going to do is they're going to list all the owners in succession. And the fifth owner bought it from the fourth owner. How did he get it? He bought it from the third owner. How did he get it? He bought it from the second owner. If there is something missing, if you can't tell how the fourth owner got it from the third owner, that's called a break in the chain of title. And the way you can correct that break in the chain of title is with a motion to quiet title lawsuit. You go to a judge and give him all the details and he can fill that gap, so to speak, or a quit claim deed. If you can find out who truly was the missing owner, they could sign a quit claim deed. And a break in the chain of title creates what's called a cloud of title. And you want to picture like a dark cloud hanging over the title, saying that there's some doubt about who the owner truly is. At closing, you're going to get a closing statement. It's an accounting statement of all the monies that changed hands during closing. And remember, we talked about our little make-believe convention about a wheelbarrow full of money, or how big the seller's check is at the end. The seller and the buyer have to be given the closing statement at the closing or prior to closing. If those parties are not attending closing, it has to be delivered to them expeditiously. Cloud on title is something that's clouding or irregularity or a possible claim or a possible encumbrance that might affect the title. And again, we can correct a cloud on title by a motion to quiet title or by a quit claim deed. A covenant is a promise. So where do we see covenants? We see covenants in mortgages, like you have a covenant to pay your taxes, a covenant of good repair. And we also see covenants in a deed. We have the covenant of quiet assurance, the covenant of quiet enjoyment, the covenant of further assurance, the covenant of warranty forever, promises that we make in a deed. And also mortgage covenants are promises we make in a mortgage. A deed is the written instrument that transfers an ownership or interest from one party to another. A deed is the tool we use to transfer ownership. And remember, a deed is signed by the grantor, and the grantee is named in a deed, but the grantee does not sign the deed. And one of the questions that comes up on the test is, where do you see a habendum clause? Well, we see a habendum clause in a deed. And a habendum clause is a clause that states how much ownership the grantor has. Does he have fee simple? Does he have a life estate? Does he have an easement? What is his level of ownership? How much of an estate does he have? Habendum is the pluperfect form of the word have in Latin. Default is when you don't do what you promised to do. You could default on a contract. And then we have remedies for default by both the buyer and the seller. So what if the seller defaults? What are the buyer's remedies? Well, the buyer's remedies are rescission. Then you can have compensatory damages, and then you can have specific performance. What are the remedies when the seller defaults? You can have rescission, you have compensatory damages, and you can have specific performance. Keep in mind that in the event the buyer defaults in New Jersey, we do not automatically have liquidated damages. We only have liquidated damages if you have a skillfully crafted liquidated damages paragraph in the contract. Now, who has liquidated damages? Builders. But on normal day-to-day contracts, we never have liquidated damages. What's the least desirable remedy for default? The least desirable remedy for default is rescission. Rescission is a return to the status quo, which means a return to the situation before we had a contract. So you're just pretending you never had a contract. Why is it the least desired remedy? Because the injured party doesn't get anything. A defect is a blemish, imperfection, or deficiency. A defective title is one that is irregular and would not be able to then have a title insurance policy issued on it. And we can correct defects again by motions to quiet title, quit claim deeds, and a couple of other tougher methods. Depreciation and accrued depreciation are what we use when we use the cost approach to appraisal. The three methods of accrued depreciation are wear and tear, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence. Earnest money is the down payment that's made as part of the purchase price as evidence of good faith. So that's very important because the earnest money is not the consideration. Remember, all contracts must be supported by consideration, but the consideration isn't the earnest money. The consideration is the house for the sales price. The earnest money is just the way the buyer shows that they're a good buyer. What happens to that earnest money deposit? It is the buyer's money, and it becomes part of the buyer's down payment. If you have a deal where you've got earnest money and you've already through attorney review and you've already met all your contingencies, and then the deal falls apart, what happens to that earnest money? Well, it has to stay wherever it is until both the buyer and the seller agree that they're going to let it go. If they don't agree, then you have to go to court to get a decision as to whether you're going to release the money to the seller or whether you're going to go back to the buyer. An easement is when the person who owns a property no longer has the right to stop someone who owns an easement for their property to come in or out of their property. And we have an easement appurtenant that is said to run with the land. And that has to have a dominant and a servient estate next to each other. And then we have an easement in gross. That's like the high tension wires passing over top of your property. That's an easement in gross. There's not two adjacent properties. Instead, there's a company that has the right to cross over your property. And easement appurtenant is said to run with the land, which means if you have an easement appurtenant on your property and you sell your property, the new owner will still be bound by the same easement. An easement appurtenant has to do with egress and ingress, going in and out of your property. If somebody has an easement on your property, you can no longer stop them from crossing over your property, coming onto your property or going away from your property. Eminent domain is the right of the government to take privately owned property for public purposes. And the method by which you take that privately owned property is through condemnation. And when we take it through condemnation, we either have to pay fair market value for it. If we only take part of the property, then we pay severance damages, and we determine the severance damages by the before and after method. And if sometimes the government does something that makes your property have no value, that's called inverse condemnation. And the property owner has to be compensated for the loss of the value of whatever the government did. An encroachment is when part of your improvements, your fence or your building, extends onto your neighbor's property. That's an encroachment. And an encroachment creates a cloud on title. Why? Because if that encroachment is there long enough, then the person is taking the extra property can file an adverse possession claim. And that would put your title in question for that little piece of property. An encumbrance is a claim or right or a lien. And when we talked about encumbrances, we showed the donkey with the pack on it. A encumbrance is something that weighs down a deed, like a lease. It complicates it or weighs it down. Like a deed restriction, it complicates it or weighs it down. Like a mortgage, it complicates it or lays it down. Like an easement, it complicates it or weighs it down. Those are all types of encumbrances. And remember, a lien is a type of encumbrance, and a lien is always a financial claim. An endorsement is a modification to a title insurance policy that extends coverage. An exception is something the title insurance company does not want to cover, like your neighbor's fence on their property. An exclusion is something they never cover. And what does title insurance never cover? It never covers eminent domain. Fee simple is the highest degree of freehold ownership. It's the completeness of the holding of the bundle of rights that gives you unqualified ownership and full possession of power, full power of disposition, and is for an indefinite period of time. And it's a type of freehold. We also have a life estate that's a type of freehold, and a qualified fee estate that's a type of freehold. The opposite of freehold estates are leasehold estates. That's where you only have the right of possession for a certain period of time. And I think I'm hearing people click off now, and we're a little bit over time, so that's enough for tonight. But I do want to remind everybody that no classes next week. We will have a bonus class tomorrow night, but no classes next week. What I will do is I will lay out a bunch of recordings from YouTube and a bunch of quizzes for you guys to take on any time during the week you want to take them. If you take the tests and they send me back the results, I will give you credit for the time in class. But again, I have a conflict and my substitute is not available. So we're going to have we'll count it as a spring break. No classes next Tuesday and Wednesday, and we will have a class tomorrow night. All right, so this was a long class tonight. I hear people quickly clicking off and getting out of here. So I will see you guys tomorrow. Let's hope we have a little bit warmer weather and drier weather.
Bruce, could you please don't forget to send me the recording for the 18, 19, 20, and 21?
So I'm a couple of issues on that. I may or may not have every one of those. Some of those we did as multiple chapters. I'll send you whatever I can get, but we're still labeling what they are, because sometimes we would do chapter 18, then chapter 12, then chapter 11, and they're all on the same recording. So, again, we're working on segregating them all and cataloging them all. But that means we have to watch every one. And sometimes, it
And
takes two.
tomorrow, you're gonna post on the website, the makeup class tomorrow?
The tests are going to be, I'll post them all by next week. We're still working on adding the pages to put every on my website. So you don't have to wait for me to email you stuff anymore. You can just go on the website and take off what you want from off the website. Because it seems to be that I am becoming the weak point in this. And again, part of the reason is we do the class on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then I'm working the rest of the week. And when I click this off tonight, it's going to take an hour, at least an hour, for the Zoom to process to become a recording. And then I have to upload that recording to YouTube and edit it. So that whole process takes hours. We'll work on it, but I'm not sure when we're going to work on it. Yes, I will be available next week, of course. And if you're looking to get signed out, we can get you signed out. But we want to make sure it would be easier if we signed you out this week. So if you're thinking of getting signed out next week, let's do it this week instead, so that we don't have to worry about catching up with each other next week. We have a,
Bruce?
yes,
Do you have 5 minutes? Now I can call you on phone.
sure. Do
Thank
you have my
Thank
phone
you.
number?
Yeah,
Not-
I think so.
okay,
I sent
so-
you a text message today.
I'm going to hang up and then I'll let you go ahead and call me. So we're done here for
Thank
tonight.
you.
We'll see you guys tomorrow.
Bruce, one more
Yes.
thing.
Nice.
I spoke to Lee because she thought that I sent you the email for me to be signed out, but it was for the information that I asked you for yesterday.
So I tried to send that today. That's what I tried to send with my message today. We'll try again in a couple hours, as soon as we finish processing tonight's class.
Okay, based off of the test scores.
Yep.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.